Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today I'm going to be counting down my top 10 favorite metal vocalists of the 1970s. So far on the channel, you've seen me count down my favorite vocalists from the 90s, the 80s, and the 2000s, so let's wrap it up here today with the 70s, my favorites in metal. But with the 70s, it's going to be a little bit more of a challenging list because, the 1970s were the formative years of heavy metal, so really what passed as metal is kind of up to your own distinction, right? I think everybody's going to have a different idea of what made and passed for heavy metal in the 70s because it was still metal in its infancy, and so you do have a lot of those pioneering bands that can kind of pass as both rock and early metal. So this list, a bit more broad than maybe my other list of the channel, right? Say a decade later with the 80s, right? Metal was a lot more defined. But that said, I have compiled a list here that I think best represents the most essential voices in metal in the 1970s, right? The most important, the most influential, and some of my personal favorites as well. So with that said, let's get started here with my number 10. Coming in at number 10 here on the list, I'm going to go with Burke Shelley of Budgie, one of the more underrated vocalists of 70s metal. Shelley, who recently passed away in 2022, was often compared at the time of Budgie's success in the 70s to Geddy Lee of Rush due to their similar appearance, their high-pitched vocals, as well as both of them were a singer-bassist combo. But Shelley and Budgie were one of the earliest metal bands, and definitely very heavy, and I think ahead of their time, all things considered. And while they only enjoyed moderate success in their prime, they would go on to influence a lot of premier bands in the new wave of British heavy metal, and a lot of heavy metal acts that would take over in the 80s. So with that in mind, highly influential, and fronting them, Burke Shelley, fantastic singer, great vocal range as well, who unfortunately we lost in 2022, but did some fantastic work with Budgie that I think is largely underrated, even almost 50 years later. For number 9, I'm going to go with a joint entry here, that going to David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes for their tenure in Deep Purple. Collectively, Hughes and Coverdale really did shake things up for Deep Purple when they joined the group for Burn here, kickstarting the Mark III lineup of the band on records like this one, like I said, Burn and Stormbringer. Both men's vocal prowess really shine through, and after the time in Deep Purple, Coverdale would go on to front Whitesnake, although I wouldn't really consider Whitesnake being metal until the late 80s. Glenn Hughes also did some solid work, but pursued a totally different direction outside of metal on his solo debut in 1977, but both men did some incredible work with Deep Purple here on Burn and Stormbringer. Really killer stuff, and Deep Purple, of course, pioneers of heavy metal. Some really heavy material on Burn and Stormbringer that I gravitate towards quite a bit. Mark III, probably my second favorite lineup of the band, following Mark II, which I'll get to Mark II in a little bit here on this countdown. Deep Purple will return later on this list, but for my number 9, I have to go with Coverdale and Hughes for their time with Deep Purple in the 70s and their contributions to the Mark III lineup. Coming in at number 8, let's go with Ozzy Osbourne of Black Sabbath. One thing people forget about Ozzy is that back in the 70s, he was a screamer in his own right, belting out some incredible vocals on classic Sabbath tracks like Symptom of the Universe, Hole in the Sky, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, NIB, and more. Just really powerful stuff there by Ozzy. I think that was definitely his vocal prime. His peak was in the 70s, fronting Sabbath. I did give Ozzy an honorable mention when I counted down my favorite metal vocalists of the 80s, and, of course, I put him as an honorable mention because, obviously, his voice is an essential part of, what defined 80s metal, right? Ozzy, as a solo artist, came into his own in the 80s and would go on to have one of the most successful solo careers in all of metal, but for what it's worth, I wanted to save him as a regular entry here for the 70s because I do feel like that was, the peak of his vocal ability, and what he did with Sabbath was his best work vocally. So with that in mind, he's going to be my number 8 here on the list. Have to go with Ozzy Osbourne during his time with Black Sabbath. Following that up now with my number 7, let's go with another joint entry here. I'm going to go with Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley of Kiss, and this might be a bit of a controversial entry here, but I think I can make a case that Kiss, especially the original lineup, are absolutely, an example of an early heavy metal band. I wouldn't classify the group as long-term metal, right? I think everything after Dynasty included, is the band going in a different direction, not really that heavy anymore, but if you look at, what they did throughout the 70s with the early lineup here, as the genre was not as defined, Kiss fit right in with their awesome live sets, killer guitar work by Ace Frehley, who'd go on to inspire and influence so many metal guitarists in the next decade and decades to come. And not to mention the fact that I think Parasite is probably the first ever thrash metal track as far as I'm concerned. But on top of that, you have the vocals by Paul Stanley, who in his prime had an immense vocal range and could hang with the very best in rock or metal on the mic. So while Paul Stanley was the better vocalist at the time, of course not so much anymore, I also wanted to include Gene Simmons here on this entry here because I feel like he always had the heavier tracks, right? The Gene songs on those early Kiss albums with the original lineup always had the heavier material personified with those thick, heavy bass lines and bass-driven tracks, as well as his mnemonic-sounding vocal delivery. So, I think when it comes to early metal, a case can absolutely be made that Gene and Paul belong on this list. Again, like I said, Kiss, not a long-term metal band, but I think with the original band and a lot of their 70s output was pretty heavy for the time. My number 6 on the list, Klaus Meine, is one of those vocalists who did both career-defining work in the 80s and 70s, which is why he appeared on both of my lists, and his unique vocals are the soundtrack to some of the band's most underrated work in the 70s, as well as their first commercial breakthrough with Love Drive in 1979, which, in my opinion, is about as perfect of a Scorpions album as you'll find, and I believe I said this as well in my 80s countdown video. Still sounds fantastic to this day. I saw the Scorpions last year, and I was blown away by the performance. I think Klaus still sounds incredible for his age, and it was really, really killer concert. So, in my opinion, Klaus has to be on this list, not just for his work in the 80s, which I counted down last week. I'll leave a link to that video in the comment section below, but also in the 70s for, like I said, his work on great records that are a bit underrated, and then, of course, their commercial breakthrough here, Love Drive. Again, like I said before, a perfect Scorpions record from top to bottom, probably my favorite release from them. I think Gene Simmons said it best when he said, "What kind of music is Rush? They're just Rush." So with that in mind, coming in at number 5 here on the list, I'm going to go with Geddy Lee of Rush. Although predominantly a progressive rock act, the band's early work borrows a lot from late 60s, early 70s pioneering metal acts like, Steppenwolf, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath as well, matched with their headbangable riffage and, of course, unmatched drumming as well. I think you can definitely make a case, and I will make the case here, that Rush belong on this list of metal acts from the 70s, and Geddy Lee, definitely one of my favorite metal vocalists of the 1970s as well. In the 70s, before they would shift focus to a more radio-friendly sound of prog rock in the 80s, Geddy Lee, simply put, nobody sounds quite like him and has one of those unique voices in rock and heavy metal. And so, while they're also my favorite progressive rock band of all time, I would consider the 70s output of Rush to be pretty heavy for its time as well, especially during a decade when metal, like I've been saying before, was not as defined as it would be like a decade later. I think, the criteria for what passed as metal was a lot broader than it would be, again, in the 80s. So, in the 70s here, Rush put out some pretty heavy material for its time, in my opinion. Of course, a great prog rock band, but I think definitely, leaned a bit towards the metal side as well at times. So, with that in mind, I wanted to include Geddy Lee in my top 5 here. Coming in at number 5, got to go with Geddy Lee of Rush. Number 4, we have Ronnie James Dio, and Dio's another name that was part of my 80s metal list, and now going to be part of the 70s list. In the 80s, well, that was his best decade for sure, in my opinion, right? First with his tenure in Black Sabbath, and then embarking on his solo career. But he also did some amazing stuff in the 70s with Ritchie Blackmore and Rainbow. Blackmore's recruitment of Dio is one of those important things to happen in metal history, as it gave Ronnie the opportunity to showcase his powerful voice to a larger audience, I think. And, I don't need to sit here and tell you guys how great of a vocalist Ronnie James Dio was, but, when focusing on his 70s work alone here, he absolutely kills it on the 3 Rainbow records, and also, while not metal, I think his work with Elf is pretty underrated as well. So when it comes to Dio's 70s output, I did want to put him on the list here in the top 5 as well. So coming in at number 4 in the top 5, I'm going to go with Dio of Rainbow and Elf. We break into the top 3 here with Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin. We'll look back upon now as a classic rock act. Zeppelin were no doubt a pioneering band in the early stages of heavy metal in the 70s, and this is probably best represented by a more guitar-driven sound. However, I can't understate how important the range and the power of Robert Plant's vocals were to the success of Led Zeppelin as well. Plant was one of the best with a 3.9 vocal octave range here. He belted out like none other could in the Zeppelin catalog. I couldn't imagine anybody singing those tracks except for Robert Plant, and his voice was incredibly impactful to metal's formative years, in my opinion. So when it comes to bands that built metal, I would definitely put Zeppelin up there with the likes of Black Sabbath and Deep Purple. So, while saying all this, I think Robert Plant definitely belongs on this list here of some of the best metal vocalists of the 70s. My number 3 on the list, getting us started in the top 3, gotta go with Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin. Number 2 on the list here, let's go with Ian Gillan. When Ian Gillan joined Deep Purple for In Rock in the early 70s, kickstarting the Mark II lineup, that was one of the most important moments in the history of metal, right? It would change the trajectory of metal history as far as I'm concerned, right? This is the record that really took the band to the next level here, and I'd consider it to be an absolute metal essential. Gillan shows incredible vocal range here on this record, with great vocal control as well. Probably, the best example of that is on Child in Time, just an amazing vocal performance, right? So, with that in mind here, I think it's probably my favorite Ian Gillan vocal performance, and obviously he did great work in the 80s as well. I mentioned this in one of my earlier videos here in this series, that, great vocalists from the 70s or great vocalists from the 80s don't suddenly become bad singers in the 90s or whatever, but, he did awesome work in the 80s with Sabbath, and then in the Mark II reunion of Deep Purple most notably, but for my money, I think his best work was in the 70s with Deep Purple and then with Gillan as a solo project. So that said, my number 2 here on the list is going to be Gillan of Deep Purple. Before I get to my number 1 pick, I have a few honorable mentions to give out here, so want to give an honorable mention out to Lemmy Kilmister of Motorhead. Of course, we have Phil Lynott of Thin Lizzy, John Kay from Steppenwolf, and Guy Speranza from Riot. All great metal vocalists from the 70s, but I can only fit 10 on the list here today. And coming in at number 1 here, in my opinion, the best 70s metal vocalist has got to be the metal god himself, Rob Halford. Now, Rob Halford was also on my list of the best 80s metal vocalists here. I think he did great work in the 70s and 80s. It's all fantastic, right? Halford still is a great vocalist, you know, but he came in at number 2 on my 80s list, and the only reason he wasn't number 1 is because Bruce Dickinson happens to exist, and they existed at the same time. But when it comes to the 70s and the best metal vocalist of the 1970s, this was Rob Halford's game, and his game alone, in my opinion, at the very top of, 70s metal vocalists here. He was, one of the best to do it at that time. Absolutely in his prime here vocally, right? Blistering vocals, a great vocal range, able to hit some insane high notes, and just a fantastic vocalist here for Priest, in addition to being a great frontman. Had to be number 1 on the list here today. Rob Halford, an incredible vocalist. Again, I think he still is. I saw Priest live in 2022 and was shocked at how great Halford sounded live, but if you go back to the 70s, during the absolute prime of his voice, I mean, just pretty untouchable as far as I'm concerned. So that wraps up this list here, counting down my top 10 favorite 70s metal vocalists of all time, which should be visible right over here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel down below. We are just about 15 subscribers away, more or less, from hitting 1.5 thousand subs here on YouTube. If you have not subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do so. It is greatly appreciated. Also, be sure to turn on the bell for notifications so you never miss a new upload. And let me know down below in the comments what are some of your favorite 70s metal vocalists of all time. And would you like to see me continue this series, maybe counting down my favorite metal singers of the 2010s? I'm not sure. I'm fine stopping here at just the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. But if you guys would be interested in seeing me sharing my thoughts on some of the best from the 2010s, I'll do that as well. So let me know all that stuff down in the comments. I definitely want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.